Hey guys, tonight we're going to talk about Victorian women and why so many of them were expected to look delicate, calm, and beautifully composed while doing far more than that delicate image ever admitted. And if you are watching this late at night, maybe after a day where you had to answer messages, look presentable, remember small things, and still somehow seem fine, then this may feel a little more familiar than it should. Because there is a very particular kind of tiredness that comes from being observed. Not from one dramatic task, and not from one terrible event, but from the steady effort of being acceptable. Sitting correctly, speaking correctly, dressing correctly, appearing rested when you are not rested, appearing grateful when you are only managing, appearing gentle when you are doing a great deal of hidden work in the background of everyone else's comfort. So get comfortable if you can. Let the room go a little dimmer. Settle your shoulders. Let your hands rest. And we will drift back into a world of cold washstands, stiff bodices, polished parlors, calling cards, candlelit bedrooms, hairpins, gloves, letters, and women who were taught to seem fragile while keeping the whole house presentable. And I should say, this topic came from a viewer suggestion, so thank you for that. These little ideas people leave behind are honestly part of what keeps this channel going, because they turn the whole thing into a quiet shared archive of strange things to fall asleep to. The Victorian woman, at least in the ideal version printed in advice books, novels, magazines, and family expectations, was not supposed to be an ordinary, tired person. She was supposed to be atmosphere. Soft, moral, pretty, patient, modest, useful, innocent but not foolish, attractive but not vain, intelligent enough to manage a home but not so intellectually ambitious that anyone felt unsettled, strong enough to keep the household moving but delicate enough to be admired for her weakness. It was a very narrow little bridge to walk across. On one side was the fear of being considered coarse, loud, selfish, unfeminine, or too physical. On the other side was the fear of seeming useless, idle, sickly in the wrong way, unattractive or badly trained. And somewhere in the middle, under a layer of linen and wool and whalebone and etiquette, she was supposed to smile gently and make it all appear natural. Of course, Victorian women did not live the same life. A factory worker, a farm wife, a maid of all work, a governess, a shop girl, a widowed mother, a wealthy hostess, and a young unmarried daughter in a respectable middle-class home could have very different days. Some scrubbed floors until their hands cracked. Some supervised servants rather than doing every task themselves. Some had money and still very little freedom. Some had no money and even less rest. So when we talk about Victorian women being exhausted, we are not saying every woman was exhausted in one identical way. We are talking about a culture that placed women under a strange double demand. Do an enormous amount, and look as though you were made of porcelain while doing it. That is the part that makes it feel so quietly unreal. A woman could be responsible for children, clothing, sick rooms, letters, social ties, servants, reputation, religious respectability, courtship, mourning customs, charity visits, and the emotional tone of breakfast, dinner, and the drawing room. Yet she was also encouraged to seem soft, passive, and a little faint, as if the world itself were too heavy for her nerves. Fragility was decorative, but the responsibility was real. And the day often began in a bedroom that was not nearly as romantic as a Victorian painting would like us to believe. Imagine the room before the fire is properly awake, with grey morning light pressed against heavy curtains and a washstand waiting in the corner. The bed is high and layered, the blankets are warm only where the body has been lying, and the air beyond them is cool enough to make the skin hesitate. There may be a pitcher of water on the washstand, and if no one has brought warm water yet, the first touch is cold. A basin, a cloth, a small mirror, a hairbrush, soap that smells clean in a plain, sharp way, the sound of fabric moving in the quiet room, the faint creak of floorboards. Somewhere below, a servant may already be working, or a younger sister may be dressing, or a child may be stirring, or the coal fire may still be only a hope. Before a respectable Victorian woman appeared to the household, she had to be assembled, not simply dressed, assembled. There were layers, a chemise, drawers, stockings, a corset, petticoats, a bodice, a skirt, perhaps another overskirt, buttons, hooks, tapes, laces, ribbons, cuffs, collar, brooch, gloves if she was going out, and a hat that had its own small architecture of feathers, flowers, ribbon or veil. Even the mourning had hardware. This is easy to forget when we look at old photographs. We see a woman standing very still in a dark dress, and because the image is silent, the clothing can seem calm. But the clothing was not calm. It had weight, it had pressure, it made demands, it shaped how she breathed, how she sat, how she bent, how she climbed stairs, how close she could stand to a fire, and how carefully she had to move through mud, dust, rain, and crowded rooms. The corset is the obvious symbol, and it should be treated gently because not every corset was the same, and many women understood their own clothing in more complicated ways than later people sometimes imagine. For some, a corset offered support, posture, and the expected outline of the body. It could feel normal because it had been worn from youth, adjusted through habit, and embedded in the idea of being properly dressed. But normal does not always mean comfortable, and expected does not always mean restful. A tightly fitted corset could press the waist and ribs, alter breathing, and make ordinary movement feel more managed. Even a less extreme corset reminded the body that it was being held in place. The body had a schedule, but the garment had rules. And over the corset came the rest of the day. The heavy skirt brushing the ankles, the petticoats shifting, the sleeve seams tugging when an arm reached too far, the collar touching the throat, the hat pins, the gloves, the small effort of never forgetting that fabric was always around you. A woman might sit in a parlor looking serene while her body was quietly negotiating with 20 separate pieces of clothing. A culture that praised feminine delicacy also wrapped women in garments that required stamina simply to wear through breakfast. And then there was the hair. Victorian hair could be a whole private weather system before the day had even begun. Long hair was often treated as an important sign of femininity, but it did not float by itself into those smooth braids, coils, twists, and arrangements seen in photographs. It had to be brushed, parted, pinned, controlled, possibly oiled or dressed, and persuaded into a shape that looked effortless only after effort had disappeared into it. In a quiet bedroom, the brushing could take on a hypnotic rhythm, stroke after stroke, hair falling over the back of a dressing gown, a lamp flame trembling slightly, pins laid out on a dish, a comb with a few strands caught in its teeth, the face in the mirror still soft with sleep and already being asked to become a public face. For girls and young women, this grooming was not just vanity, it was training. A neat appearance suggested order inside the soul. Untidy hair could imply laziness. A careless dress could imply poor breeding. A stain, a loose thread, a missing button, or a glove not properly mended could become evidence, as if the whole moral character of a woman might be read from the hem of her skirt. That is a tiring way to live. To become legible through details, to have the world search your surface for clues, and after the body was dressed, the behavior had to be dressed as well. Victorian etiquette was not just about simple kindness or consideration. It could become a large, invisible machine full of timing, rank, introductions, calling hours, acceptable subjects, seating arrangements, mourning rules, chaperonage, letter forms, visiting cards, and the delicate art of not appearing to want anything too strongly. A woman was expected to know these rules and to carry them lightly. She was expected to enter a room with the right degree of confidence and modesty, to speak enough but not too much, to be pleasant but not familiar, to be graceful while accepting tea, while being introduced to someone she might not like, and while pretending not to notice that she was being evaluated. The parlor was the soft stage where much of this happened. Imagine a room with heavy curtains, patterned carpet, framed pictures, a fireplace, carved chairs, a small table, and a tray waiting for cards. The light is filtered and slightly dusty. The clock ticks with great seriousness. The sofa is not built for sprawling. It is built for posture. Here, a woman might receive visitors, make conversation, pour tea, observe the rules of hospitality, and preserve the household's reputation through small movements that looked effortless only because they had been practiced for years. Calling cards are one of those tiny Victorian details that seem almost charming from far away. A little card with a name, a visit, a tray in the hall, a record that someone had come by at the proper hour and had respected the proper form. But beneath the charm was another layer of accounting. Who called? Who returned a call? Who failed to call? Who stayed too long? Who was admitted? Who was told the lady was not at home, which might mean she was not at home, or might mean she was very much at home and not receiving. Social life had paperwork, and much of that paperwork belonged to women. The calling card was small, but the meaning around it was not. A neglected visit could cool a relationship. A mismanaged introduction could cause offense. A drawing room could look peaceful with its teacups and polished table, while a quiet little network of obligation moved underneath it like threads under embroidery. That is one of the main things to understand about Victorian female exhaustion. It was not only physical, it was social. It was the tiredness of remembering who must be pleased, who must be soothed, who must be impressed, who must not be offended, and which expression was safest for the room. Even silence had to be managed. A woman who spoke too plainly could be judged. A woman who said too little could be thought dull. A woman who seemed merry might be charming unless she became too merry. A woman who appeared sad might be interesting unless she became inconveniently sad. A woman had to be readable but not transparent. The whole personality had stays and laces. Meanwhile, beyond the parlour, the household kept moving. In wealthier houses, servants did much of the hard physical labour, and it would be a mistake to pretend that a lady of the house was scrubbing every step herself if she was not. But supervision was its own form of work, and for the servants, the work was often far more direct and much harder on the body. The Victorian home was not one calm machine. It was many tired people moving in different degrees of visibility. Downstairs, a maid might rise in the dark, clean grates, carry coal, haul water, scrub stone, polish metal, answer bells, carry trays, wash linens, and climb the stairs again and again until the house above appeared smooth. Upstairs, the mistress of the house might plan menus, direct servants, monitor supplies, preserve respectability, arrange visits, oversee children, host relatives, write letters, and make sure no domestic failure became visible to guests or husband. The labour was unequal, but it was connected. The lady's calm often depended on the servant's exhaustion, and the servant's survival often depended on the lady's judgment. A middle-class woman with one servant, or no reliable servant, could find herself caught between the ideal of refinement and the reality of housework. She had to keep up appearances while doing or supervising tasks that the ideal itself treated as almost invisible. She might not want neighbours to know how much work she did with her own hands. She might have to answer the door looking composed while there was flour on the table, a child crying in the next room, wet laundry hanging where it should not be seen, and a dinner schedule quietly beginning to fall apart. The house had a front and a back. The front was the parlour, the polished stair, the good curtains, the calling card tray, the room where visitors could believe in order. The back was the kitchen heat, the scullery damp, the coal dust, the laundry steam, the nursery noise, the mending basket, the storage cupboard, the medicine bottle, the unpaid bill, the servant problem, the anxious list of things that had to be done before anyone respectable arrived. Victorian femininity often asked women to live in both places at once, to know the back of the house intimately, and to appear as if they belonged entirely to the front. There is something quietly draining about being the hinge between the hidden and the presentable. The day might move from bedroom to breakfast room to nursery to kitchen conversation to parlour to writing desk to hallway to bedroom again, and at every threshold the woman adjusted herself slightly. A different tone for a servant, a different tone for a child, a different tone for a husband, a different tone for a visitor, a different tone for a letter, a different tone for the mirror. And because moral respectability was attached so tightly to women, the household's failures could become her failures even when she did not control the world around her. If a servant left suddenly, she had mismanaged the servants. If dinner was poor, she had failed at domestic economy. If a daughter behaved too freely, she had failed at moral training. If a son was spoiled, she had indulged him. If the house was too plain, she lacked taste. If the house was too decorated, she was vain or wasteful. The correct amount of everything was always somewhere in the middle, and the middle kept moving. Then there was the body, which Victorian culture loved to discuss and conceal at the same time. Women's bodies were treated as delicate, mysterious, medically significant, and morally charged, yet the ordinary facts of those bodies were often wrapped in silence. A woman's health could shape her day, but polite conversation gave her very few clean ways to say what was happening. Menstruation in particular carried a strange hush. A woman might be expected to continue dressing, receiving, supervising, attending church, answering letters, and behaving with composure while dealing with pain, weakness, or discomfort that could not be mentioned directly. The practical arrangements were not always easy either. Before modern disposable products, menstrual management involved cloths, laundering, discretion, and privacy that might be difficult in a crowded house or a house full of servants. There were practical details to hide, linens to manage, discomfort to downplay, and a face that still had to look suitable for tea. No wonder some women appeared pale. They were allowed to be delicate in theory, but not necessarily allowed to be inconvenient in practice. This is the odd little trap of Victorian fragility. Female weakness was admired as an aesthetic, but actual bodily need could become a nuisance. A fainting woman in a novel might be poetic. A tired woman who needed the household to stop for her was much less charming. Fainting itself became part of the period's strange language of femininity. It certainly happened for real. Tight clothing, heat, poor nutrition, illness, stress, crowded rooms, and limited breathing could all make a person lightheaded. But faintness also became a cultural sign, a gesture the era understood. A woman who swooned was not simply unwell, she was also legible as sensitive, refined, overcome, too gentle for harshness. The fainting couch sits in our imagination because it captures the contradiction so neatly. A piece of furniture for collapse. Elegant collapse, preferably. Not the collapse of someone allowed to stop working completely, but the collapse of someone whose weakness could be arranged into a graceful pose. There is a room in that image. A dim sitting room perhaps, with a low couch, a small table, a bottle of smelling salts, a curtain stirring slightly, and a woman lying very still with one hand near her forehead. It looks peaceful. It almost looks like rest. But rest that must be aesthetically acceptable is not fully rest. Even exhaustion had a costume. Doctors and advice writers often spoke about women's nerves, sensibility, hysteria, delicacy, and reproductive health in ways that could both acknowledge suffering and limit women at the same time. A woman's education might be questioned because too much study was thought by some to strain the body. Ambition could be framed as unhealthy. Strong opinions could be softened into nerves. Sadness, boredom, anger, and lack of freedom could be translated into a problem belonging to the woman herself, rather than to the smallness of the world allowed to her. It is easy to hear the quiet exhaustion inside that. Imagine being tired because you are overworked, restricted, lonely, understimulated, physically uncomfortable, and socially watched, and then being told that your own nature is simply fragile. The explanation becomes another weight. Still, within these limits, women kept whole worlds of activity alive. They wrote letters, so many letters. So many letters. Letters to mothers, sisters, cousins, friends, husbands, away on business, sons at school, daughters visiting relatives, charitable committees, tradesmen, doctors, clergymen, and anyone whose relationship needed tending through ink. A Victorian writing desk could be a quiet command center, with paper, envelopes, sealing wax, blotting paper, a pen, an inkwell, and a stack of obligations that looked thin until each one had to be answered. Letter writing could be intimate and beautiful, but it was also labor. It required tone, it required memory, it required the right level of warmth. A condolence note could not be too brief. A thank you note could not be too late. A letter to a suitor had to suggest feeling without seeming improper. A letter to a relative might need to smooth over family tension with polite phrases and careful omissions. The hand moved across the paper while the mind did social arithmetic. What can be said? What must be implied? What must never be written down? And when the letter was finished, the work was not only the words, it was the emotional adjustment afterward, the self folded back into place, like paper into an envelope. Marriage expectations added another soft pressure that could begin early and settle over a young woman's life like a curtain. For many women, marriage was not merely romance. It was money, social identity, family duty, future security, and one of the few approved pathways into adult authority. To marry well could protect a woman. To remain unmarried could expose her to dependence, pity, financial uncertainty, or a role as the useful extra woman in someone else's household. So courtship was not light even when it was conducted through dances, visits, glances, flowers, and letters. A young woman had to be attractive but modest, interested but not eager, accomplished but not intimidating, healthy but delicate, sensible but not calculating. Her clothes mattered, her family mattered, her dowry or lack of dowry mattered, her manners at dinner mattered, the way she refused or accepted attention mattered, even her quietness could be interpreted. And there is a particular tiredness in having your future watched through your small behaviors. The drawing room becomes less like a room and more like a glass case. There she sits, perhaps in a pale dress under lamplight with a book nearby, while relatives notice who speaks to her, who does not, whether she blushes, whether she laughs too freely, whether she lowers her eyes at the correct moment, whether she seems promising, whether she has begun to fade from the market of youth. It sounds harsh when stated plainly, but polite society often hides harsh things under soft fabrics. A ribbon can be a ribbon, and it can also be a deadline. Once married, the expectations shifted rather than vanished. The wife became responsible for creating a home that reflected her husband's status and moral character. She might manage the household budget while having limited legal or financial independence, depending on time, place, and class. She might bear children, return to social obligations, supervise servants, and become the emotional cushion between her husband, children, relatives, and the outside world. If her husband was difficult, she was expected to be patient. If money was tight, she was expected to be economical. If children were ill, she was expected to nurse them. If relatives visited, she was expected to host them. If grief entered the house, she was expected to observe it properly, dress for it properly, write about it properly, and make sorrow itself respectable. Victorian mourning customs could be beautiful in their symbolism and deeply heavy in practice. Black clothing, stationary borders, jewelry made with hair, restricted social activity, and carefully graded stages of grief turned loss into another system women often had to manage. And still, through all of this, the ideal woman was not supposed to become visibly bitter. She could be pious, she could be pale, she could be tender, she could be resigned, she could be beautifully sad. But anger had very little room to sit down, so it went somewhere else. Into headaches, perhaps, into silence, into letters never sent, into the way a needle moved through cloth, into the careful closing of a door, into the slow folding of a shawl, into the hand resting for one extra second on the stair rail before entering the room where everyone needed something. Needlework itself is worth pausing over because it appears so peaceful in old images. A woman by the window, a basket beside her, white cloth in her lap, the needle rising and falling, the small click of scissors, the softened daylight. the expression lowered and unreadable. It looks restful because it is quiet. But quiet work is still work. Mending, hemming, marking linens, trimming garments, repairing lace, and keeping fabric respectable could take countless hours. A torn seam was small, but small things multiplied. A family wore through cuffs, stockings, shirts, collars, petticoats, sheets, towels, and table linens with a persistence that never ended. Fabric was everywhere. Fabric had to be washed, aired, dried, pressed, stored, scented, guarded from damp, guarded from moths, altered, passed down, revived, and made presentable again. The Victorian house was full of cloth, and cloth remembers labour. It remembers the hands that scrubbed it, the back bent over it, the eyes strained by lamplight to stitch it. The woman who knew which sheet was thinning, which glove needed mending, which ribbon could be reused, and which dress might be turned or trimmed to survive one more season. If there were children, the fatigue grew softer and more constant. Victorian motherhood was wrapped in sentiment, but the daily reality could be relentless. Children needed washing, teaching, correcting, feeding, comforting, dressing, praying over, and watching. A mother might be expected to be tender without being indulgent, morally firm without being harsh, affectionate without losing authority, and always responsible for forming character in the nursery. The nursery could be a warm room and a noisy one. Wooden toys, small boots, a fireguard, a basin, a chair where a tired woman sits with a child against her shoulder, the smell of soap, wool, milk, medicine, and dust warmed by the grate, a lesson book lying open, a little sock gone missing, a baby crying in one room while an older child asks a question from another. The mother may have help, or she may not. Either way, she is the moral center of the scene. That sounds flattering until you realize that a center is where weight gathers. Religion, too, could bring comfort and weight at the same time. Many Victorian women found real meaning in faith, church, charity, and moral community. But moral expectation could also thicken around them. Women were asked to be pure, charitable, forgiving, modest, and spiritually elevating, as if the household's conscience had chosen their chair and refused to leave. Charity work could open a door beyond the home, but it could also become another obligation. Visiting, sewing for causes, organizing bazaars, raising funds, bringing soup, and demonstrating compassion in approved ways all required time, clothing, energy, and social coordination. Even goodness had appointments. And perhaps that is the deepest exhaustion in this world. Not simply that women worked. Women have always worked. But that so much of their work was wrapped in the expectation that they should disappear into it gracefully. The good woman should not make her effort too visible. The good hostess should not show strain. The good wife should not complain. The good daughter should not rebel. The good mother should not resent. The good invalid should suffer prettily. The good widow should grieve correctly. The good young woman should wait, but not seem to be waiting. Everything depended on women noticing, and almost no one was supposed to notice the noticing. As evening settles over the Victorian house, the exhaustion changes texture. The morning cold has gone, the day clothes have been worn for hours, the firelight is warmer now, and lamps soften the edges of the parlour. A tray may be carried in. Curtains are drawn. The street outside becomes dark and muffled. Somewhere in the house, a servant is still moving. Somewhere, a child is being put to bed. Somewhere, a letter waits unanswered. The woman in the drawing room may look composed. Her hair is still pinned. Her bodice is still fastened. Her face is arranged. She may hold a book, or sewing, or a teacup. She may listen to her husband read aloud, entertain a guest, or sit through the kind of conversation that requires just enough attention to be polite and not enough honesty to be restful. Inside the body, though, the day has left its traces. The pressure of the corset, the ache under the ribs, the tired feet, the dry eyes from lamplight, the skin marked faintly by seams. The mind still moving through tomorrow's tasks before today has fully ended. Had the morning note been answered? Was the blue dress still suitable? Had the last call from Mrs. Ellison been returned? Was the nursery cough improving? Would the new maid stay? Should the letter be warmer? Was the church charity visit expected tomorrow? Had she seemed impatient at dinner? These are not dramatic thoughts. That is why they are so good at keeping a person awake. They are small enough to seem unimportant and numerous enough to fill the room. By bedtime, the woman must be unassembled again, pins removed, hair loosened, bodice opened, skirt taken off, petticoats untied, corset unlaced, stockings removed. The body released in stages, as if the day itself had been fastened around her and now had to be carefully undone. There is a softness in that final bedroom scene. The candle burns low. The washstand waits again. The mirror holds a dim face. Hair falls differently now, no longer arranged for visitors, no longer proof of discipline. The quiet room receives the private person underneath the public one. And perhaps this is where the contradiction becomes clearest. Victorian culture liked to imagine women as naturally delicate, naturally gentle, naturally suited to the home, naturally moral, naturally self-sacrificing, naturally patient. But there is nothing natural about being watched into shape every day. There is nothing effortless about effort that has learned to hide itself. There is nothing weak about carrying a household's comfort, reputation, correspondence, rituals, illnesses, clothing, manners, servants, children, grief, and social survival while being told that your finest quality is fragility. So, when we imagine a Victorian woman fainting on a couch, or sitting pale beside a window, or writing by lamplight with one hand at her temple, we can let the image remain soft without making it simple. Maybe she is theatrical, maybe she is ill, maybe she is hungry. Maybe her corset is too tight, or the room is too warm, or her body has been difficult all day in a way she cannot politely explain. Maybe she has answered 6 letters, corrected 3 children, soothed a relative, supervised a servant, endured a call, and smiled through a conversation that gave her no room to be honest. Maybe she is not fragile in the way her world imagines. Maybe she is simply tired. And maybe the strangest part of all is that the tiredness was often hidden inside beauty, inside the polished hair, inside the clean glove, inside the folded letter, inside the soft voice in the parlor, inside the graceful hand resting near the teacup, inside the candlelit hallway where no one sees her pause for a moment before going upstairs. The Victorian house is quiet now. The calling cards have been left in the tray. The parlor chairs hold their shapes. The fire is settling into red ash. The washwater has cooled. The dress hangs heavy in the shadow. The hairpins lie in a small dish. Somewhere, paper waits on a desk for tomorrow's careful words. And behind all that polished stillness is a woman who spent the day being useful, attractive, moral, modest, sociable, composed, and somehow delicate at the same time. No wonder she was exhausted. So, as we leave her there, in the dim room with the house finally softened around her, we do not need to make the past louder than it was. We can just notice the small things. The loosened ribbon, the cooling basin, the tired hands, the quiet relief of taking off the clothes that made her acceptable, and the strange little piece of a room where, for a few hours at least, no one is calling, no one is watching, no one is expecting her to be porcelain. Just a person, finally allowed to disappear into sleep.